with an assay sheet promising $23.40 a ton pressed to her chest. How could Martha Dalton tell if she was holding salvation, or the same lure that had already buried 3 men? The courthouse bells struck 7 as Martha Dalton folded the assay slip into quarters, the ink still tacky against her thumb. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves of Brennan's Mercantile, each drop keeping time like she couldn't afford. The paper crinkled as she tucked it inside her coat. $23.40 per ton, enough to change everything if the numbers held true. Morning papers don't usually smile back, said Thomas Burke, emerging from the telegraph office with his leather satchel. His boots squelched in the March mud, and like smoke from a banked fire. Just checking grain prices. Martha adjusted her shawl, feeling the assay's sharp edges against her ribs. Widows got to know where the market sits. Thomas nodded toward the blue cloth draped across the courthouse steps. Somebody's forgotten their washing. The quilt square caught morning light, its faded indigo pattern familiar as her own heartbeat. Martha's grandmother had stitched those stars during the Missouri winters, each point a prayer for spring. But the cloth didn't belong here, spread across courthouse stone like a flag of surrender. "Strange place to dry laundry," Thomas said, setting his cup on the Mercantile's porch rail. His fingers drummed against the wood, a telegraph man's habit, Martha noticed, always tapping out invisible messages. She stepped closer to the courthouse, her boots finding purchase on the wooden walkway. The cloth was deliberately placed, covering something embedded in the top step. A brass corner gleamed beneath the fabric's edge, catching sunlight like a coin. "Don't remove the cloth," she whispered, more to herself than to Thomas. But he'd already set down his satchel, curiosity beating caution. His hand reached for the blue fabric, and Martha's chest tightened. The assay papers rustled as she moved, and Thomas's fingers froze at the sound. "What you got there, Martha?" "Nothing that concerns telegraph men." She forced a smile, but her hand pressed tighter against the papers. "Just widow's business." The mine whistle shrieked once across the valley. Shift change at 7:30, same as always. But Thomas's attention had returned to the courthouse steps, his fingers working the cloth's corner loose despite her warning. The brass underneath gleamed brighter as more surface showed, and Martha could make out the curve of letters, the faint curve of names. "Somebody wanted this found," Thomas said, lifting the fabric completely. A brass memorial plate lay flush with the stone, its surface polished to mirror brightness. 3 names were etched in careful script: James Morrison, William Hayes, Samuel Garrett lost to greed, the 15th of March, 1884. Below the names, a 4th line read, "The truth will surface." Martha's hand trembled against the assay papers. 3 years ago those men had died in the Clearwater mine collapse. The town had called it bad timber, poor engineering, the price of reaching too deep too fast. But Martha remembered other whispers, corners cut, safety ignored, profit over lives. Thomas studied the plate, then looked up at Martha. "You know anything about this?" The morning shadows shifted as clouds passed overhead, and Martha felt the weight of the assay against her chest. $23.40 per ton. The same ore grade the Clearwater had been chasing when the ceiling came down. "I know those men had families," she said quietly, "and I know they deserved better than they got." By 10 o'clock, word of the memorial plate had spread through Silverton like creek water through a broken dam. Martha sat in Millie's boarding house, the assay papers spread on the kitchen table, while Millie poured coffee that tasted of chicory and regret. "Somebody's stirring up old ghosts," Millie said, her voice pitched low. "The boarding house walls were thin, and paying guests didn't appreciate political talk with their morning eggs. Question is whether it's justice or revenge they're after." Martha folded the assay along its creases, the paper soft as fabric now from handling. The numbers hadn't changed $23.40 per ton, but their meaning kept shifting like shadows on snow. If the Clearwater's collapse hadn't been accidental, if someone had pushed the miners past safety for the sake of rich ore, then Martha's own property, the abandoned claim her husband had left her, might hold the same deadly promise. "Thomas Burke was asking questions at the telegraph office," Millie continued, refilling Martha's cup. Wanted to know who might have paid for that brass plate when it got installed. Why nobody noticed it before. And metal work like that comes from Denver. Takes weeks to cast and ship. Somebody planned this months ago, maybe longer. Millie's weathered hands wrapped around her own cup, seeking warmth. Whoever it was, they wanted the whole town to see. The front door chimed, and Martha quickly refolded the assay, slipping it back into her coat. But it was only Doc Hensley, stamping snow from his boots and muttering about the weather. The old physician had attended all 3 funerals after the Clearwater collapse, had signed the death certificates that blamed cave-in and bad luck. "Morning, ladies." Doc hung his coat on the peg by the door. "Heard there's excitement at the courthouse." "Just somebody's forgotten quilt," Martha said carefully. Doc's eyes sharpened. "Quilt that happens to cover a memorial to dead miners? That's a coincidence with teeth, wouldn't you say?" Martha felt the assay papers crinkle as she shifted in her chair. Doc Hensley had been in Silverton longer than anyone, had seen the town grow from tent camp to permanent settlement. If anyone knew the truth about the Clearwater collapse, it would be him. "Those men died honest deaths," Doc said, but his voice carried the weight of doubt. "Cave-ins happen. Timber fails. It's the price of digging deep." $23.40, Martha said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Doc's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "What did you say?" The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of Millie's mantel clock. Martha realized she'd spoken the assay number aloud, had let the pressure of secrets crack her careful composure. "Nothing," she said. "Just thinking about grain prices." But Doc was studying her with the same intensity he'd shown examining patients, looking for symptoms beneath the surface. "Martha, if you know something about the Clearwater—" "I know it's closed," she interrupted, standing abruptly. The chair scraped against the wooden floor, and the sound echoed through the boarding-house like a gunshot. "And I know some questions are better left buried." She headed for the door, her hand pressed against the assay papers. Behind her, she heard Millie and Doc exchange whispers, but their words were lost beneath the sound of her own heartbeat and the distant call of the mine whistle marking another shift change. The schoolhouse bell chimed noon as Martha stood at the edge of her husband's claim, looking down into the valley where the Clearwater mine sat like a wound in the mountainside. The abandoned headframe pointed at the sky like an accusation, its timber blackened by 3 years of weather and neglect. She pulled the blue quilt square from her pocket. She'd retrieved it from the courthouse steps before anyone else could claim it as evidence. The fabric was soft between her fingers, worn thin by decades of use and washing. Her grandmother had pieced this square during the hard winter of 1869, when the Missouri snows had lasted through April and the seed money had run low. For remembering, Grandmother had said, stitching each star with careful precision. Some things shouldn't be forgotten, even when forgetting would be easier. Martha spread the cloth on a flat boulder, smoothing its edges against the stone. The March wind carried the scent of pine and distant snow, but underneath lay another smell, the metallic tang of exposed ore, the dusty breath of abandoned mine shafts. Her claim sat directly above the Clearwater's old diggings, and the assay papers proved what she'd long suspected. The vein ran rich and true, following the mountain's spine like a golden river. But knowing the ore was there, and knowing how to extract it safely, were different kinds of knowledge entirely. The Clearwater's collapse had taught the whole town that lesson written in timber and stone and 3 men's lives. She pulled the assay from her coat, unfolding it carefully. $23.40 per ton. Rich enough to lift her from widow's poverty, rich enough to give her choices beyond taking in washing and hoping for kindness, but also rich enough to tempt her into the same mistakes that had killed Morrison, Hayes, and Garrett. The wind gusted, lifting the corner of the quilt square. Martha pressed it flat again, and in that gesture felt the weight of belonging, not just to the land, but to the people who'd died for it, who'd loved it, who'd trusted it to hold their dreams in their bones. She thought of Thomas Burke's questions, Doc Hensley's knowing looks, the brass memorial plate that someone had installed in secret and revealed in public. The town was asking for truth, but truth had a price, and Martha wasn't sure she was wealthy enough to pay it. But sitting here with her grandmother's cloth, and her husband's claim, and the ghost of 3 dead miners, she realized that some debts couldn't be avoided. Some truths demanded telling, regardless of cost. She folded the assay papers and tucked them back into her coat. The quilt square went into her pocket, its blue fabric warm against her palm. Whatever came next, she'd face it with the tools she had: memory, courage, and the kind of stubborn love that kept a woman stitching through the hardest winters. By 2 o'clock, the Silverton saloon held more whispered conversations than a church confessional. Martha pushed through the batwing doors, the assay papers and quilt square making small weights in her pockets. The afternoon crowd consisted mostly of off-shift miners and merchants avoiding their wives, but she recognized several faces from the crowd that had gathered at the courthouse. Widow Dalton called Jake Morrison from his corner table. James Morrison's younger brother, she realized, the miner who'd been working double shifts to support his dead brother's family. "Buy you a drink?" "Coffee, if they have it." Martha approached his table carefully, aware that conversations were dying around them as other patrons strained to listen. "Heard there was some excitement this morning." Jake's laugh held no humor. "Somebody wants to make sure we don't forget what happened at the Clearwater. Question is, what good does remembering do when the mine's sealed and the dead are buried?" Martha sat across from him, accepting the coffee cup that appeared at her elbow. The brew was stronger than Millie's, bitter as mining camp justice. "Maybe remembering isn't about the dead. Maybe it's about the living." "You think somebody killed my brother?" Jake's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because if that's what you're saying—" "I'm saying your brother deserved better than he got. All 3 of them did." Martha pulled the assay papers from her coat, unfolding them on the scarred wooden table. "And I'm saying maybe they weren't the only ones put at risk for the sake of rich ore." Jake stared at the numbers, his weathered face going pale. "Where'd you get these?" "Same place your brother was digging when the ceiling came down." Martha's hand found the quilt square in her pocket, drawing comfort from its familiar texture. 23.40 per ton. Rich enough to make men careless, desperate enough to make them dangerous. The saloon's conversations had stopped entirely now, and Martha could feel eyes on her from every corner. But Jake Morrison was the only audience that mattered, the man whose grief had been carved into 3 years of extra shifts and bitter silence. "The Clearwater wasn't the only claim showing that grade," Martha continued, "but it was the deepest dig, the most ambitious. Someone pushed those miners past safe practices because they could smell the money in the rock. Someone like who?" Jake's fist clenched around his whiskey glass. "You got names or just suspicions?" Before Martha could answer, the saloon doors swung open and Thomas Burke stepped inside, his telegraph satchel slung over his shoulder. His eyes found Martha immediately, and she saw knowledge there, the kind of dangerous information that travelled over wire and arrived in coded messages. "Mrs. Dalton," Thomas said, approaching their table. "Mind if I join you? I've got some interesting news from Denver." Jake gestured to an empty chair, his attention still fixed on the assay papers. "Depends on whether your news helps or hurts." Thomas sat, pulling a yellow telegraph form from his satchel. Got a reply from the metalworks that cast that memorial plate. "Interesting thing is, the order was placed 6 months ago, paid for with a bank draft drawn on the First Bank of Silverton. Account holder was listed as Estate of William Hayes." Martha's breath caught. Hayes had been the youngest of the 3 dead miners, barely 22 when the cave-in took him. He didn't have an estate, died unmarried, no property. Exactly. Thomas spread the telegram on the table. So either a dead man ordered his own memorial, or somebody's been using his name to hide their identity. The bank draft was countersigned by Charles Morrison. Jake's whiskey glass hit the table hard enough to slosh amber liquid across the wood. "That's my father. He's been dead 8 years." "Another dead man's signature," Thomas said grimly. "Whoever's behind this has been planning for months, using the names of the deceased to cover their tracks. But they made one mistake. The brass plate includes a 4th line that wasn't in the original order. 'The truth will surface' was added after casting, etched by hand. Martha felt the pieces clicking together like the tumblers of a lock. Someone had wanted the memorial found, had orchestrated its discovery and placement for maximum impact. But the message wasn't just about remembering the dead, it was about exposing whoever had killed them. "There's more," Thomas continued. I sent inquiries to the territorial mining inspector, asked about the Clearwater investigation. Turns out the official report was filed by Owen Brennan, not the inspector himself. Brennan signed off on the cave-in as accidental. No further inquiry needed. Martha's blood turned cold. Owen Brennan owned the mercantile, held mining interests throughout the valley, and served as unofficial mayor of Silverton. He also had the authority to approve or deny new mining permits, including any attempt to work her husband's claim. Brennan knew those men were digging in bad ground, she said quietly. But he let them continue because the ore was too rich to abandon. That's a serious accusation, Jake said, but his voice carried hope now alongside anger. You got proof? Martha looked around the saloon, noting the faces of men who'd worked for Brennan, who owed him money or favors, who depended on his goodwill for their livelihoods. The afternoon light slanted through dusty windows, and she realized that whatever move she made next would echo through the whole community. She pulled the quilt square from her pocket, spreading it on the table next to the assay papers and the telegram. The blue fabric looked fragile beside the harsh realities of territorial politics and mining profits, but it carried its own authority, the weight of memory, the stubborn persistence of truth. This belonged to my grandmother, she said. She taught me that some things shouldn't be forgotten, even when forgetting would be easier. Those 3 men died because someone valued ore over lives. If we let that stand, if we keep pretending it was just bad luck, then we're saying that some people matter less than others, that their deaths were acceptable losses. The saloon held its breath, waiting for her decision. Martha folded the quilt square carefully, tucking it back into her pocket alongside the assay papers. When she stood, her chair scraped against the floor like a bell marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The memorial plate wasn't meant to honor the dead, she said. It was meant to challenge the living. Someone wants the truth told, and they're counting on us to have the courage to tell it. The courthouse steps filled with people as the 4 o'clock sun slanted low across the valley, painting the gathered crowd in shades of gold and shadow. Martha stood at the top of the steps, the memorial plate gleaming at her feet like a brass mirror reflecting the town's collective conscience. She held the assay papers in one hand and the blue quilt square in the other, feeling the weight of testimony and memory. Owen Brennan pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger and exertion. "This is ridiculous, Martha. You're stirring up trouble over a mining accident that happened 3 years ago." Those men knew the risks when they signed on. Did they? Martha's voice carried across the courthouse square, reaching the miners gathered near the livery stable, the merchants clustered by the mercantile, the women who'd stopped their afternoon errands to witness whatever truth was about to be revealed. Or did someone convince them the risks were acceptable when they weren't? She unfolded the assay papers, holding them high enough for the crowd to see the official seal and the damning numbers. $23.40 per ton. That's what the ore was running when Morrison, Hayes, and Garrett died. Rich enough to make a man forget about safety, desperate enough to make him ignore the signs of unstable ground. "Assay papers prove nothing," Brennan shouted, but his voice cracked on the words. "Rock falls happen. Timber fails. It's the nature of the work." Thomas Burke stepped forward from the crowd, the telegram form in his hand. "The territorial mining inspector never saw the Clearwater site," he announced. Owen Brennan filed the accident report himself, declared the cave in an act of God, and sealed the mine before any official investigation could take place. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. Martha saw faces. She recognized Jake Morrison, his jaw set with 3 years of accumulated grief. Doc Hensley, his weathered features grave with professional certainty. Millie from the boarding house, her arms crossed in judgment. "Furthermore," Thomas continued, "the memorial plate was ordered using forged signatures from 2 dead men. Someone wanted this truth revealed, but they were afraid to attach their own name to the accusation." Martha stepped closer to the edge of the courthouse steps, her boots finding solid purchase on the stone. The brass plate gleamed beneath her feet, catching the late afternoon light and throwing it back at the assembled crowd like a beacon. "I know who ordered the plate," she said quietly, but her words carried in the still air. "It was William Hayes's sister, Sarah, who moved to Denver after the funeral. She saved for months to pay for the casting, used her brothers' names to hide her identity because she was afraid of what might happen if Owen Brennan knew she was asking questions. She'd received Sarah's letter that morning, delivered with the dawn mail and written in the careful script of a woman who'd learned to read by candlelight. The letter had explained everything. The months of investigation, the careful planning, the desperate hope that someone in Silverton would have the courage to speak the truth. Sarah Hayes included something else with her letter, Martha continued, reaching into her coat. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges yellowed with age and handling. It's a letter her brother wrote the week before he died, talking about the bad timber in the lower shafts, the warning signs that were being ignored. Owen Brennan stepped forward, his face pale now despite the afternoon sun. Letters can be forged, same as signatures. You can't prove anything with 3-year-old paper and wild accusations. No, Martha agreed. But I can prove that the same conditions exist right now, on other claims in other mines. And I can prove that you knew about them. She held up the assay papers again, letting the crowd see the official seal and the recent date. This is from my husband's claim, the one that sits directly above the old Clearwater workings. 23.40 per ton, just like the ore that killed those 3 men. And yesterday, Owen Brennan offered to buy my claim for $50, about 1/10 of what the ore rights are actually worth. The crowd's murmur deepened into angry voices, and Martha saw several miners step closer to the courthouse steps. She recognized the signs of a community's patience reaching its breaking point, the moment when individual grievances combined into collective action. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about making sure that William Hayes's death and his sister's courage meant something lasting. "I'm not asking for Owen Brennan to be hanged," Martha said, her voice rising above the crowd's anger. "I'm asking for the truth to be acknowledged, for the families of those dead men to receive compensation, and for the territorial mining inspector to conduct a proper investigation of safety practices in this valley." She knelt and placed the blue quilt square on the memorial plate, covering the brass surface with her grandmother's faded indigo stars. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of ceremony, of witness, of a community's decision to remember its dead properly. "This cloth has survived 40 years of Missouri winters and Colorado storms," she said. "It's outlasted droughts and blizzards, good years and lean ones. My grandmother stitched it to last, because she knew that some things are worth preserving." She stood, leaving the quilt square on the memorial plate like a flag of remembrance. Those 3 men deserved better than they got. Their families deserved honesty instead of convenient lies. And this town deserves to know that we value human lives more than ore profits. Doc Hensley stepped forward from the crowd, his medical bag in his hand and his face set with professional determination. "I'll testify to the territorial inspector," he announced. "I examined those bodies, saw the injuries that didn't match the official story. I kept silent for 3 years, but I won't keep silent anymore." Jake Morrison joined him, his miner's lamp gleaming in the afternoon sun. "The boys at the Lucky Strike have been talking. We've seen the same corner-cutting, the same pressure to dig deep regardless of safety. If there's going to be an investigation, we'll tell what we know." More voices joined them: miners, merchants, women who'd lost husbands to cave-ins and gas explosions. The courthouse square filled with testimony, with truth that had been buried for 3 years under the weight of economic necessity and political convenience. Owen Brennan looked around at the crowd, his face gray as winter sky. "You don't understand the economics," he said desperately. "This town survives on mining. If we shut down every claim that shows risk, we'll all starve." "We understand perfectly," Martha replied. "We understand that dead miners don't buy supplies or pay rent. We understand that families broken by preventable accidents become a burden on the whole community. And we understand that a town built on lies is no stronger than a mine shaft propped with rotten timber." The courthouse clock chimed 5 times, marking the end of the business day and the beginning of whatever came next. Martha looked out over the crowd, seeing the faces of her neighbors transformed by the possibility of justice, of truth, of a future built on something more solid than greed and expedience. The brass memorial plate gleamed beneath her grandmother's quilt square, 3 names etched in metal and memory. But the 4th line, "The truth will surface," promised that those deaths would not be forgotten, that their meaning would outlast the men who'd profited from their silence. A week later, Martha stood at the Silverton depot, watching the territorial mining inspector's train disappear around the mountain curve like a black snake following the rails toward Denver. In his leather satchel rode testimony from 37 witnesses, documents proving systematic safety violations, and a recommendation that Owen Brennan be removed from all mining oversight positions pending criminal investigation. The blue quilt square lay folded in her pocket, clean now from washing but still carrying the weight of witness. She'd retrieved it from the memorial plate after the inspector's visit, but its work wasn't finished. Truth, like good fabric, required careful tending to last. Thomas Burke approached from the telegraph office, his face bright with news. "Got word from the territorial capital," he said. "The Hayes family is being awarded compensation from the Territorial Emergency Fund. It's not much, but it's acknowledgement that their loss was preventable." Martha nodded, feeling a loosening in her chest that had been tight for 3 years. Justice moved slowly in territorial courts, but it moved. What about the other families? Morrison and Garrett estates too. And there's talk of establishing a mining safety commission requiring regular inspections of all active claims. Thomas shifted his satchel to his other shoulder. "Your testimony made the difference, Martha. The inspector said he's never seen a case presented so clearly." Through the depot window, Martha could see the courthouse square, where a small but steady stream of visitors stopped to read the memorial plate. Someone she suspected it was Jake Morrison had planted mountain flowers around the brass marker, their purple blooms bright against the grey stone. "The assay results came back from Denver," Thomas continued. "Your claim is even richer than you thought. The Geological Survey thinks the vein runs for at least half a mile, possibly more." Martha pulled the final letter from her coat, an offer from a Denver mining company to lease her mineral rights for $1,200 per year, plus royalties. Enough to live comfortably, to choose her own path without depending on charity or the kindness of neighbors, but also enough to require careful decisions about safety, about the balance between profit and human life. "There's something else," Thomas said quietly. "Sarah Hayes is coming back to Silverton. Says she wants to be here when they reopen the investigation into her brother's death. She asked me to thank you for having the courage to speak when she couldn't." The afternoon train whistle echoed across the valley, carrying passengers and freight toward destinations that existed only as names on a timetable. But Martha was exactly where she belonged, in a town that was learning to value truth more than convenience, memory more than profit. She touched the quilt square in her pocket, feeling the careful stitches her grandmother had placed during that long-ago Missouri winter. Some things were worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth the cost of speaking difficult truths. The mining boom would continue. Colorado's mountains held too much wealth to remain idle, but it would continue with better laws, stronger oversight, and the knowledge that 3 men's deaths had not been in vain. Their names would be remembered not just on a brass plate, but in every safety regulation that prevented future tragedies. Martha walked back towards town, her boots finding easy rhythm on the wooden sidewalk. Behind her, the depot clock chimed the hour, marking another day's passage in a community that had chosen remembrance over forgetting, justice over expedience. The cloth had been removed, and the town had faced its truth. Now came the harder work of living with that truth, of building something better from the foundation of what they'd learned. But Martha had her grandmother's quilt square, her husband's claim, and the knowledge that courage once found could be summoned again when needed. Some things, she thought, were worth preserving. Some truths were worth the telling, regardless of cost. If something here touched you, stay a while. We'll carry the rest.